So I'll be talking about pain and borderline personality disorder. This is with Maria Zannarini and the McLean study for adult development. So just to give a bit of background on the interaction between pain and borderline personality disorder, there's a fair bit of literature on pain and BPD. One of the interesting findings, it's been replicated quite a few times, is that pain thresholds, but not detection thresholds, when pain severity thresholds in BPD are increased. And this has been found in a number of different modalities. So using a cold stimulus, patients with BPD who engage in self-harm have a higher pain threshold, and they actually find that the group had reductions in measures of depression, anger, anxiety, confusion after participating in the cold stimulus test, suggesting that it might have a bit of an emotion regulation effect. Similar results were found using laser-evoked pain, and in that case they found that the differences were not related to the ascending sensory pathway. And again, using electrical shocks, similar results were found. Heat sensation in BPD patients who reported no pain on self-injury, when they scanned those people with fMRIs, they found, again, increased pain thresholds, and there's a bit of different brain activity compared to the healthy control groups. The BPD patients had decreased activity in the parietal cortex, increased activity in the left dorsolateral, and decreased activity in the perigenual part of the ACC and the right amygdala. And another study that also used fMRI methodology demonstrated that blood flow changes in the dorsolateral, prefrontal cortex, and limbic areas following combinations of affective, material, and painful experiences. And they basically suggested that the painful stimuli led to improved regulatory processes in BPD patients compared to controls. So, despite this issue about having a higher pain threshold, pain is actually still a problem in a lot of physical pain. I didn't specify that. Physical pain is a problem in patients with BPD. Again, a number of studies have found this. Patients who screen positive for BPD are more likely to report lifetime pain problems, more likely to abuse prescription medications, and they're found in pretty much all types of settings. So in primary care, in primary care with chronic pain issues, about almost half of the patients meet loose DIB criteria for BPD. Internal medicine clinics, about a quarter of patients with chronic pain met BPD. In outpatient pain clinics, 7 to 15% met self-report criteria for BPD. They're often being seen for chronic back pain problems. And of note, patients with chronic back pain, the presence of any type of PD nearly doubled the odds of not being able to return to work after 6 months. So this is actually fairly important from a functional standpoint too. In complex regional pain patients, over half met criteria for any type of PD, and similar results for low back pain patients. So one study actually asked about the role of negative affects as well. So assessing BPD symptoms, pain symptoms, and negative affect in rehab patients, they demonstrated an association between BPD symptoms and pain severity, but found that the effect was mediated by negative affects and in particular depression. And this is something to keep in mind as we go on. Just I should make a side point about the health status of patients with BPD, which tends not to be so great. Patients with BPD often have more medical problems like TMJ, fibromyalgia, etc. They tend to have more obesity, more osteoarthritis, diabetes, hypertension. Their health behaviors are not as great. They don't exercise as much. They smoke, use pain and sleep medications more. So all of these things are important to take into account as well. And patients with pain are seen in psychiatry in a number of different settings, including inpatient units, where about a third of patients have a significant amount of pain. And there are a few interesting predictors there. Age, BMI, not so surprising, but childhood experiences also predicted pain severity. And there's a fair bit of literature on the interaction between childhood adversity and chronic pain. One nice meta-analysis found that people abused in childhood are much more likely to have more pain symptoms as adults, and patients with chronic pain problems, conversely, are more likely to have experienced abuse as a child. And the results are significant. The effect sizes are not so big, though, 0.12 to 0.33, so that's pretty small. So in this study, we'll be looking at a few different things. 2 patients with BPD in this sample experience more pain and more pain interference in their life, and what are the factors that we find in our sample that are significant? And then we'll add on a little bit as well about the dysphoric affects that might be associated with pain as well. So this is the MSAD study sample. So all the patients were initially treated as inpatients, and at baseline they were between 18 to 35 years old. IQ was over 70. There are no diagnosis of schizophrenia, schizoaffective, bipolar 1, or organic condition, obviously fluent in English. And these patients were followed up every 24 months. And by this study, we're at 16 years. So at baseline, 290 participants with BPD, 72 with another personality disorder. And at 16-year follow-up, over 80% in each group of the surviving patients were retained, which is really excellent follow-up. And we'll be looking particularly at the cross-sectional data from the 16-year follow-up time point, and the groupings are based on the initial diagnosis. So there's a number of interviews and assessment measures we used, background information schedule for demographics, the SCID-1, the DIBAR, the DIPD, and the abuse history, and then at follow-up time points, we basically used follow-up versions of each of these instruments. And there are a couple self-report measures I'll go into a little bit more detail about. The dysphoric affect scale, which is a 50-item self-report that measures emotional states and cognitions, commonly seen in BPD. So it asks people to rate in the previous month what percent of the time have you spent experiencing these different affect states, basically. Things like sadness, hopelessness, thinking that life isn't worth living, etc. And the brief pain inventory is the pain measure that we'll be talking about mostly. It's a reliable, well-validated, and well-used instrument. And it's got 17 items that measure pain, as well as how much pain interferes in one's life. The pain measure that we'll be focusing on, the one that's most commonly used to refer to pain severity, is the average rating of pain. So the BPI assesses pain, asks someone, have you experienced pain in the past 24 hours? If yes, then please rate from 0 to 10 what the average pain is, the worst pain, the least pain, the current pain over the past 24 hours. And then it asks as well 9 items to assess how the pain is interfering in one's life. It asks a few other questions, like where the location of the pain is, but we'll skip those for today. Basic statistics for this, and it's cross-sectional. We'll look at chi-scores, compare the groups experiencing pain, and amongst those who do experience pain, we'll do t-tests to compare the severity ratings and regression analyses to see how the different variables contribute to pain. So what you can see here is that the BPD group reports experiencing significantly more pain in the previous 24 hours than the group with other personality disorders. And in terms of, for those who do experience pain, the severity of pain in the BPD group is significantly greater. So just to remind you, the scale is out of 10. So the BPD group, on average, reports experiencing 4.5 out of 10. It's pretty high. The pain interference is also significantly greater in the BPD group than in the other personality disorders group. And that holds true for every individual item, all of those 9 items that make up the pain interference. So things like mood, walking, et cetera, all of those are, the BPD patients experience significantly more interference on all of these items compared to the other personality disorders. So when we look at the predictors of pain severity, starting with univariate predictors, there's a couple on this screen. Age is a significant univariate predictor. Increasing age predicts pain. And the presence of major depressive disorder. Included alcohol and substance use disorders as well, just to account for the potential interaction of substance use and the interaction with pain. In terms of the psychosocial factors, 3 of them showed up to be significant on univariate predictor analysis. So childhood neglect, other childhood abuse, which includes verbal, emotional, and physical abuse, and the number of forms of adult abuse, emotional, verbal, physical, sexual. We added them up to kind of get a bit of an idea of severity. But child sexual abuse was not significant. And again, just as I say at the bottom, just to remind people, this is amongst the people who experience pain with the diagnosis of BPD. So when we take those univariate predictors, put them together for a multivariate analysis, we find 3 that end up being significant: age, the presence of major depressive disorder, and other childhood abuse. Now, just to go on quickly to talk about the dysphoric affects that are associated with pain. Again, this is using all the 50 items from the dysphoric affect scale and seeing which of those affects, dysphoric affects, are associated with pain. There were 4 that were significant out of the it's out of 48. I took out the ones that actually stated you are in pain. So the ones that remain significant is feeling like the pain will never end, feeling sad, thinking about killing oneself, and there was a negative association with desire or thinking of hurting oneself. And just to give you an idea of interpretation, as I mentioned, these are on a 0 to 100 scale, so for every 10% increase or 10-point increase in how much sadness you've experienced over the past month, you'll basically have like a quarter-point increase in the sadness that you experience, or in the pain that you'll experience, sorry. So basically the BPD group does experience higher intensity of pain than the other personality disorder patients, and also, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's consistent results that demonstrate higher pain thresholds in BPD patients. So this suggests in combination that the subjective experience of patients with BPD is experienced more intensely when it is experienced. This is also just consistent with results that are found in patients who have major depressive disorder alone, and also in patients who have been sexually abused in childhood. It's been suggested that maybe the trait of harm avoidance, as mediated by the central serotonergic pathways, might explain some of this. Our study doesn't go into that. Now, one other thing that is important to mention, though, is the role of medical illnesses. And we actually didn't, in this study, I didn't take into account all the different medical illnesses, but that would be something to look at, particularly as time goes on, because this is 16-year follow-up of a sample, and as time goes on, more and more of these people are going to start to have serious physical illnesses, and the role that their diagnosis of BPD can play in their illnesses is something worth looking at. So I mentioned there are several univariate predictors of pain: the age, major depressive disorder, and a few forms of psychosocial factors. In the multivariate model, the ones that remain significant: age, which is not so surprising, as increasing age is associated with increasing pain severity. And the major depressive disorder is quite consistent with the previously found research. Now, childhood adversity increases the risk of having increases pain severity in adulthood. And there have been several reports that demonstrate that all forms of childhood abuse are associated with increased pain problems. And one study from the NCS found that childhood experience of abuse and major depressive disorder were both independent predictors of pain severity, much like we found. Now, as for why childhood sexual abuse in our study didn't predict adult pain severity is a little bit surprising. Maybe previous studies didn't divide up the forms of abuse as much, or very well could be the way that we coded or rated childhood sexual abuse for this study in particular. Now, the affective predictors of pain, as I mentioned, the cognitions and the emotions that were associated with increased ratings of pain, these ones are actually fairly consistent with what one would experience with depression, that the pain will never end, represent very much like hopelessness, sadness, the suicidality in major depression, so perhaps that might be explaining part of it. Now, the wanting to hurt oneself, which is negatively associated, is interesting, and it suggests that maybe the emotion regulation benefits of self-harm are only useful when there's a change from what's currently being experienced. So if someone's got a chronic pain issue, inducing more pain in themselves might not have the same emotion regulation benefit as it would in someone else. Other affective experiences like anger, emptiness, loneliness, those sorts of things are not associated or not affective predictors in the same way. So just to make a couple mentions of limitations, this was originally an inpatient sample, so perhaps the sample doesn't represent exactly what's seen in the community. The patients might have, a lot of them did receive intermittent or different types of treatment over the 16 years of follow-up, and we only used the brief pain inventory at the 16-year follow-up, so it's a cross-sectional thing. As time goes on, we'll be able to expand on this a little bit more and particularly look at the interactions with physical illness and health behaviors as people age. Thank you. Okay.
examine the relationship between pain and self-injury?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, yeah. Did you examine the relationship between pain and self-injury? I mean, I know you said that like there wasn't thoughts about wanting to hurt oneself, I think, but
Yeah, no, we didn't look at self-injury in this. But that would be something worth looking at, because
yeah,
it would
I
certainly be
think
interesting over
like
time.
with the cold presser task and self-injury have been shown, yeah, like, right, okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Oh, yes.
Would I be accurate if I were to say that a person has a real injury, say for instance they've hurt their wrist or they, semi hit the back of the car, would they experience probably more pain than a person who was borderline?
Based on what this research says, presumably yes. Once they cross that threshold of experiencing pain, their pain will be rated as more severe. And what you're describing certainly sounds like something that would cross anyone's threshold. Yes. Yeah, that's what I was referencing at the beginning. Yeah, a lot of work on that.
In my work, I frequently see borderline and other severely personality disorder patients having had multiple surgeries of an elective or semi-elective nature, and I was curious if there were any correlations in your work with that. So in other words, they may present with more pain symptoms and then have surgeries, or vice versa. They may have iatrogenically caused pain secondary to presentations.
This study didn't look at that, but that is a very good point, and that would certainly be consistent with previous research from this lab that shows that there's a lot more medical illnesses. Medical interventions are more likely to be used as well, things like surgeries. Surgeries I'm not 100% sure about, but medical interventions and resources used are significantly higher. Thank you.